The ghost in the system. A man walked the corridors of Blackwood Correctional Facility for 17 years, mopping floors, emptying trash bins, maintaining order in the chaos of incarceration. Guards nodded to him. Inmates respected his quiet presence. The warden approved his work requests without question. Yet when a new administrative director arrived and demanded a complete audit of all personnel files, something impossible emerged. The janitor had no employee record, no background check, no hiring documentation. He simply didn't exist on paper. What happens when the most visible person in a prison becomes completely invisible to the system? Subscribe now to discover a story that challenges everything you think you know about identity, purpose, and the power of quiet persistence. Marcus Webb had worked in the records department for 3 months when he noticed the discrepancy. It started with payroll, a routine cross-reference between physical time cards and digital employee profiles. Every name matched perfectly until he reached the janitorial staff listing for Cell Block D. Thomas Kincaid, the time card read, accompanied by a supervisor's initialed approval for 40 hours of work that week. Marcus typed the name into the database. Nothing appeared. He tried variations. T. Kincaid, Kincaid Thomas, even potential misspellings. The system returned 0 results across all employee classifications: current, former, or suspended. Assuming a clerical error, Marcus walked to Human Resources with the time card. Helen Pritchard, who had managed HR for 12 years, examined the card with mild interest that quickly transformed into confusion. "I approved this myself last Friday," she said, pointing to her initials. "I remember signing it." "But there's no file," Marcus insisted. Helen's fingers moved across her keyboard with increasing urgency. She accessed archived records, searched by Social Security number ranges, checked federal contractor databases. Each query produced the same result: negative. "This is impossible," Helen whispered. "We can't employ someone without documentation. It's federal law. The audits alone would have caught this years ago." "How long has he worked here?" Marcus asked. Helen stood abruptly. "Let me check the physical archives." They descended 3 floors to the basement storage facility, where decades of paper records remained preserved in fireproof filing cabinets. Helen pulled folders systematically, moving backward through years of hiring documentation. 2023 nothing, 2024 nothing, 2025, still nothing. She paused at a folder marked 2008, the year the prison transitioned to digital record keeping. Her hands trembled slightly as she flipped through personnel files from that transitional period. "Here," she said finally, extracting a single document. The paper had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained clear. It was a maintenance request form, dated January 2008, requesting custodial services for newly renovated administrative offices. At the bottom, someone had scrawled, "Thomas Kincaid assigned, ongoing." No signature, no employee number, no supporting documentation. "Who authorized this?" Marcus asked. Helen examined the form carefully. "I don't recognize the handwriting. This was before my time." They stood in silence, the weight of bureaucratic impossibility settling around them. Somewhere 3 floors above, a man who didn't officially exist was cleaning the very offices where his absence from the system would soon become the prison's most investigated mystery. The warden's dilemma. When confronted with the impossible, institutional power faces a profound choice: acknowledge the failure or protect the illusion of control. Warden Catherine Reeves had built a career on maintaining order through meticulous documentation and unwavering protocol. Now, her prison contained a man who shouldn't exist, and everyone knew his name. What happens when the rules you've enforced become the bars of your own prison? Engage with this chapter and discover how truth challenges authority in ways no rebellion ever could. Catherine Reeves read the preliminary report 3 times before summoning her administrative counsel. Each reading intensified the migraine building behind her left eye, not from confusion, but from the implications. Thomas Kincaid had been paid consistently from the general maintenance budget for 17 years. Thousands of dollars, all documented through approved time cards, all processed through legitimate payroll systems. all deposited into a bank account that, according to federal banking records, belonged to a man with a valid social security number and tax history. He'd known this moment would eventually arrive. The digital age made true invisibility impossible. It merely delayed the inevitable. What surprised him wasn't that he'd been discovered, but rather how long the illusion had persisted. At lunch, Kincaid sat alone in the employee cafeteria, as was his custom. He ate methodically, turkey sandwich, apple, water, while observing the complex social dynamics of prison staff. The corrections officers clustered by rank and shift assignment. Administrative personnel maintained separate tables, the invisible hierarchy that governed every institution. "Heard you got called to the warden's office," a voice said. Kincaid looked up. Officer Marcus Thompson slid into the opposite seat uninvited. Thompson was young, maybe 30, with the aggressive confidence of someone still proving himself. "Word travels fast," Kincaid observed. "Everything travels fast in here. Inmates, staff, doesn't matter. Secrets don't last." Thompson leaned forward. "So what did you do? Steal something? Touch something you shouldn't have?" "I cleaned floors and emptied trash cans, Officer Thompson. Same as every day for the past 17 years. "Then why's the warden calling you in?" Kincaid took a deliberate bite of his sandwich, chewed slowly, swallowed before responding. "Perhaps she wants to compliment the quality of my work." Thompson snorted. "Right. You nervous?" "Should I be? Man, if I got summoned to Reeves' office, I'd be sweating bullets." Kincaid stood, collecting his tray. "Then it's fortunate I'm not you, Officer Thompson." He returned to work, finishing the administrative corridor before moving to cell block D. The inmates recognized his presence with subtle nods, respect earned through consistent, principled interaction rather than fear or dominance. Tomorrow would bring questions he'd avoided for 17 years. But tonight, he would complete his rounds, maintain the order he'd carefully constructed, and prepare for the moment when invisibility would finally end. The interview. Power speaks loudest through questions, but wisdom reveals itself through answers that transform the questioner. Warden Reeves had conducted hundreds of interviews, suspects, employees, inmates seeking favors, and she prided herself on reading people through their reactions to pressure. But what happens when the person across the desk treats interrogation not as threat, but as inevitable conversation? Dive into this chapter to witness how calm defies authority and truth emerges not through force, but through patient revelation. Thomas Kincaid arrived at the warden's office at 7:55 a.m., carrying nothing but 17 years of practiced composure. He wore his standard maintenance coveralls, freshly laundered, and waited in the outer reception area with hands folded calmly in his lap. Catherine Reeves emerged at exactly 8 o'clock. "Mr. Kincaid, please come in." The office was designed to intimidate. Large desk, high-backed leather chair, walls covered with commendations and photographs documenting a distinguished career in corrections. Kincaid took the single chair facing the desk, settling into it with quiet dignity. Deputy Warden Chen stood near the window. Marcus Webb sat to one side with a laptop, ready to transcribe. Helen Pritchard completed the panel, her expression uncertain. Catherine began without preamble. "You understand why you're here?" "You've discovered irregularities in my employment documentation," Kincaid replied. "Or rather, the absence of documentation." "You don't seem concerned." "Would concern change the facts, Warden?" Catherine leaned forward. "Mr. Kincaid, according to our records, or lack thereof, you don't officially exist as an employee of this facility. Yet you've been paid regularly for 17 years. That's fraud." "Is it?" Kincaid's tone remained neutral. "Fraud requires deception for personal gain. I've deceived no one, and I've gained only what I earned through honest labor." "You've been paid without proper employment authorization." "Have I been paid? Or has someone named Thomas Kincaid been paid?" He paused, letting the distinction settle. "There's a difference, Warden. One involves criminal intent. The other involves bureaucratic oversight." Chen stepped forward. "Are you saying you're not Thomas Kincaid?" "I'm saying the question of who I am matters less than the question of what I've done. For 17 years, I've maintained your facility. I've cleaned floors that inmates walk, offices where decisions affecting lives are made. I've done this work with integrity and consistency. Does my absence from a database negate that contribution? Catherine's frustration mounted. This isn't philosophy, Mr. Kincaid. This is federal employment law. I need answers. Who hired you? How did you circumvent our background check process? Why isn't there any record of your application? Everything was legitimate except his employment itself. Someone explain this to me, Catherine said when her department heads assembled in the conference room. How does a ghost draw a salary? Deputy Warden Robert Chen spoke first. The payroll system requires supervisor approval, which he received consistently. The checks were never flagged because the amounts were appropriate for his classification and hours worked. But there's no employment contract, Catherine interrupted. No I-9 verification, no background check, which is mandatory for anyone working in a correctional facility. The system assumed he existed, Helen Pritchard offered quietly. His name appeared on schedules, supervisors confirmed his work, the inmates recognized him. The bureaucracy filled in the gaps with assumption. Catherine's jaw tightened. Assumption doesn't satisfy federal auditors. Marcus Webb cleared his throat nervously. There's something else. I checked with the State Department of Corrections. They have no record of Thomas Kincaid being cleared for prison employment. But when I called the background investigation unit, the agent I spoke with said his name sounded familiar. She's checking her closed files. Familiar how? Catherine demanded. She wouldn't say, just that she'd call back. The warden stood and walked to the window overlooking the prison yard. Below, she could see a figure in maintenance coveralls pushing a cleaning cart toward the education building. From 4 stories up, she couldn't distinguish features, but the purposeful, unhurried gait was unmistakable. Has anyone actually spoken to him? She asked. Directly, about this? Silence filled the room. You're telling me we've discovered a massive administrative failure, potentially criminal fraud, and nobody has thought to question the man at the center of it? With respect, Warden, Chen said carefully. We don't yet know if this is fraud. It might be something else entirely. Such as? Chen hesitated. An oversight that became institutionalized. A clerical error that nobody caught for 17 years. Or what? Or Thomas Kincaid had reasons for remaining invisible that we haven't yet understood. Catherine turned from the window. Schedule an interview. Tomorrow morning, my office, 8 a.m. I want answers, and I want them documented. If this man has been operating under false pretenses, we need to know immediately. If he's a victim of administrative incompetence, he deserves an explanation and proper employment status. And if it's something else? Helen asked. The warden's expression hardened. Then we'll discover exactly what we've been harboring for 17 years. The summon's true character reveals itself not in comfortable routines, but in moments of unexpected confrontation. Thomas Kincaid had spent 17 years perfecting the art of purposeful invisibility, not from cowardice, but from calculated necessity. Now, that invisibility was about to shatter. How does a man prepare for questions he's hoped would never come? Follow this chapter to witness the moment when silence becomes the most powerful form of testimony. The summons arrived during Thomas Kincaid's morning rounds. He was cleaning the administrative corridor on the 3rd floor when Deputy Warden Chen approached with careful, measured steps, the kind of approach that signaled official business rather than casual conversation. Thomas, do you have a moment? Kincaid paused, his mop resting lightly against the wheeled bucket. He was 56 years old, with silver threading through close-cropped black hair and hands marked by decades of manual labor. His expression remained neutral, patient. Of course, Mr. Chen. The warden would like to see you tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, in her office. A lesser man might have flinched or demanded reasons. Kincaid simply nodded. I'll be there. Chen lingered, as if expecting questions, protests, or at minimum curiosity. When none came, he added, This is regarding your employment records. There seem to be some irregularities. I understand, Kincaid replied evenly. You don't seem surprised. Should I be? The deputy warden studied him carefully. Most people would want to know what this is about. Most people aren't janitors in a maximum security prison, Mr. Chen. I learned a long time ago that questions often create more complications than answers. Kincaid returned his attention to mopping, his movements fluid and practiced. I'll answer whatever the warden needs to know. After Chen departed, Kincaid continued his work with the same unhurried precision he'd maintained for 17 years. The ritual of cleaning had become meditation, repetitive motion that allowed his mind to process while his hands maintained order in a fundamentally disordered environment. He was a correctional officer, she said finally. A good one who paid the price for integrity. The timeline matches, Marcus confirmed. He resigned from Riverside in December 2007. The first maintenance request at Blackwood appeared in January 2008. He didn't want to be in the system, Catherine realized, because the system had failed him. Helen Pritchard entered, summoned by Marcus's earlier text. She read the documents with mounting understanding. This explains the lack of background check, she said. He'd already been vetted, investigated, and cleared. Someone at Blackwood, probably Daniel Foster, the maintenance supervisor, gave him work without going through official channels, maybe as a favor, maybe because he recognized talent and integrity. Which means Foster knowingly circumvented employment protocols, Catherine said. Or he saw someone who needed work and deserved a second chance, Helen countered. Foster died before digital systems caught the oversight. By the time anyone might have noticed, Kincaid had been here for years. The system just absorbed him. Catherine returned to the documents, focusing on Kincaid's testimony in the abuse investigation. His statements were detailed, precise, documented with dates and specific incidents. He'd kept meticulous records, not to protect himself, but to protect the vulnerable. He's been doing the same thing here, she said quietly. Maintaining order, protecting dignity, staying invisible so he could do the work without becoming a target again. So what do we do? Marcus asked. The federal audit is coming. We can't hide this. Catherine stood, decision crystallizing. We don't hide it. We document it properly, finally. We give Thomas Kincaid the official employment status he should have had 17 years ago. And we acknowledge that sometimes, the system's failures are corrected not through bureaucracy, but through individuals who simply do what's necessary. The auditors won't like it, Chen warned. The auditors will accept facts, Catherine replied. The fact is, we have an exemplary employee who's been undocumented due to administrative oversight. We're correcting that oversight now. That's not criminal. That's responsible management. She gathered the documents. Schedule another meeting with Kincaid. This time I'm not interrogating him. I'm apologizing and offering him what he's earned, recognition and legitimacy. The choice. Recognition can be a gift or a burden, depending on why invisibility was chosen in the first place. Thomas Kincaid had spent 17 years building a life defined by purposeful obscurity, not from shame, but from hard-earned wisdom about institutional dynamics and the price of standing apart. Now, Warden Reeves offered him something most people desperately sought: official acknowledgement and documented legitimacy. But what happens when visibility threatens the very peace that invisibility made possible? Stay with this chapter to witness how a man chooses between validation and preservation of purpose. Thomas Kincaid returned to the warden's office at 2 p.m., noting immediately the shifted atmosphere. Catherine Reeves stood when he entered, a gesture of respect that hadn't been present during the morning's interrogation. "Please sit," she said, her tone altered from authoritative to almost apologetic. Kincaid took his seat, observing Deputy Warden Chen and Helen Pritchard with the same calm attention he brought to all interactions. Catherine slid a folder across the desk. "We found the 2007 investigation files from Riverside. I've read your testimony, your resignation letter, and the commendations you received before everything fell apart." Kincaid opened the folder but didn't read. He already knew what it contained. "You were a correctional officer," Catherine continued. "An exceptional one, by all accounts. You testified against colleagues who were abusing inmates, and that testimony cost you your career." "It cost me a position," Kincaid corrected gently. "Not a career. I continued working. In obscurity, without documentation or recognition. With purpose," he replied. "Recognition is complicated, Warden. Sometimes it illuminates, sometimes it exposes. I chose work that allowed me to contribute without becoming a focal point." Catherine leaned forward. "Mr. Kincaid, Thomas, I want to rectify this situation. I want to process your employment properly, provide full benefits, document your 17 years of service, and give you the recognition you deserve. Why? The question hung in the air, simple but profound. Because it's right, Catherine said. Because you've earned it. Because our institution failed you once. And I won't compound that failure by allowing you to remain invisible. Kincaid was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of careful consideration. Kincaid was silent for a long moment, his gaze steady. When he spoke, his voice carried weight earned through years of careful observation. January 2008. The prison was transitioning to digital systems. Your maintenance supervisor at the time was Daniel Foster. Good man, died of cancer 3 years later. There was a backlog of work requests, and the regular janitorial staff was understaffed. Someone needed to fill the gap. Someone put you on the schedule, Helen interjected. Without proper authorization. Perhaps. Or perhaps I simply began working, and the system accommodated me because order requires maintenance. Buildings don't care about bureaucracy, Warden. They need someone to keep them functional. That's not how institutions work, Catherine insisted. Isn't it? Kincaid's question held no challenge, only inquiry. Institutions are built on assumption that people will follow procedures, that systems will catch errors, that order maintains itself. But order is an illusion requiring constant effort. I provided that effort. The institution accepted it because the alternative was chaos. Marcus looked up from his laptop. The background check agent called back this morning. She said your name appeared in a closed investigation from 2007. She couldn't provide details without authorization, but she confirmed you were cleared of any wrongdoing. Cleared of what? Catherine demanded. Kincaid stood slowly. With respect, Warden, that investigation ended 17 years ago. What matters is whether I've been a security risk during my time here. Have I endangered anyone? Facilitated contraband? Compromised your facility in any way? The room fell silent. No, Catherine admitted finally. You haven't. Then perhaps, Kincaid said quietly. The question isn't why my records don't exist, but whether that absence has caused any actual harm. The investigation deepens. When the present refuses to make sense, the past becomes the only map forward. But some paths were meant to remain hidden. The background check agent's cryptic reference to a 2007 investigation opened doors that Warden Reeves couldn't ignore, even as Thomas Kincaid's calm acceptance suggested those doors should have stayed closed. What secrets lie in archived files, and why would a man choose 17 years of invisible labor over documented legitimacy? Continue reading to discover that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in seeking recognition, but in deliberately avoiding it. Marcus Webb received authorization to access the 2007 investigation files at 11:30 a.m. He sat in the records basement, alone except for rows of filing cabinets containing decades of institutional memory, and opened the manila folder marked Kincaid, Thomas, Investigation Closed. The first document was a memorandum from the State Department of Corrections, dated March 15, 2007. It referenced a complaint filed by inmates at Riverside Correctional Facility regarding systematic abuse by correctional officers. The complaint had been dismissed as unsubstantiated, but a parallel internal investigation had been initiated. Thomas Kincaid's name appeared on page 4. According to the report, Kincaid had worked as a correctional officer at Riverside for 11 years before the investigation. Multiple inmates had identified him as different from his colleagues, someone who treated prisoners with basic human dignity, who intervened when other officers became excessive, who documented incidents that others ignored. The investigation had cleared Kincaid of any misconduct. In fact, his testimony had been instrumental in identifying 3 officers involved in systematic abuse. Those officers were subsequently fired and criminally charged. But there was more. A supplemental document, added 6 months later, noted that Kincaid had requested reassignment to another facility. The request was denied due to budget constraints and staffing shortages. 2 weeks after that denial, Thomas Kincaid had resigned from the Department of Corrections entirely. His resignation letter was attached. I can no longer work in an institution where doing what's right makes me a target rather than a colleague. My testimony protected inmates from abuse. but it cost me the trust of the very people I'm supposed to work alongside. I cannot effectively perform my duties in an environment of hostility and suspicion. Marcus photographed every page, his mind racing through implications. He climbed back to the administrative offices and found the warden in a budget meeting. "You need to see this," he said urgently. "Now." Catherine excused herself and followed Marcus to a private conference room. He spread the documents across the table like pieces of a puzzle finally beginning to form a coherent picture. She read in silence, her expression shifting from frustration to comprehension to something approaching respect. "I appreciate the gesture, Warden. Truly. But I need you to understand something about visibility. At Riverside, my testimony protected inmates from abuse. That was the right thing to do. I have no regrets about that decision. But visibility made me a target. Not from the inmates I protected, but from the officers whose colleagues I'd exposed. Suddenly, every action was scrutinized, every decision questioned. The hostility wasn't overt. It was subtle, constant, exhausting. I couldn't do my job effectively because visibility transformed me from a colleague into a symbol." "This isn't Riverside," Chen interjected. "Every institution has similar dynamics," Kincaid replied without judgment. "I'm not criticizing Blackwood. I'm explaining why obscurity became preferable. For 17 years I've maintained your facility without the complications that recognition brings. Officers nod to me because I keep things clean and functional. Inmates respect me because I treat them with basic dignity without drawing attention to myself. I'm useful precisely because I'm unremarkable." Helen spoke carefully. "But you're owed benefits, Thomas. Proper health insurance, retirement contributions, legal protections. By remaining undocumented, you've sacrificed significant compensation." "I've sacrificed money," Kincaid agreed. "Not purpose. There's a difference." Catherine felt frustration rising, but suppressed it. "So you're refusing official employment status? I'm asking you to consider why that status matters. To whom does it matter, and for what purpose? It matters for federal compliance. It matters for institutional integrity. Does it matter for the work itself?" Kincaid's question was genuine, not rhetorical. "Will documenting me improve the cleanliness of your facility? Will it make inmates safer or officers more effective? Or will it satisfy bureaucratic requirements that have no bearing on actual function?" "Both can be true," Catherine insisted. "I can satisfy federal requirements while also ensuring you receive proper compensation and protection." Kincaid nodded slowly. "Then I'll propose a compromise. Process my employment documentation. Provide the benefits you mentioned, but don't publicize it. No announcement, no recognition ceremony, no acknowledgement beyond necessary paperwork. Let me continue working as I have, visible in action, invisible in identity." "Why?" Catherine asked, genuinely confused. "Most people want credit for their work." "Most people," Kincaid said quietly, "haven't learned that credit and effectiveness often work against each other. I'm effective because I'm unremarkable. Maintain that, and I'll accept whatever documentation you need." Catherine exchanged glances with her colleagues. "You're asking for legitimacy without visibility. I'm asking for function over recognition, if that's possible within your systems." The warden considered carefully. "It's unconventional, but possible." "Then we have an agreement." The revelation. Some stories reveal themselves not through dramatic confession, but through quiet accumulation of observed detail. Pieces falling into place when someone finally looks closely enough. Marcus Webb had discovered Thomas Kincaid's bureaucratic absence, but absence explained nothing about presence. How a man moved through a maximum security prison with such universal respect. Why inmates deferred to a janitor with the same careful attention they showed to veteran corrections officers. What subtle authority he wielded without ever claiming power. Subscribe now to discover how watching reveals more than asking, and how true influence operates beneath the surface of official recognition. Marcus Webb began observing Thomas Kincaid with new attention. Not suspicious surveillance, but curious study, trying to understand how a man cultivated such unusual respect through work that most people considered invisible. He started in cell block D during afternoon rounds. Kincaid pushed his cleaning cart with methodical precision, stopping at each cell to empty trash receptacles. The inmates tracked his progress with subtle awareness. Kincaid, one called from his bunk. Got a minute? Thomas paused, setting down his collection bag. What do you need, Davis? My mom's sick. Got a letter yesterday. Cancer. I'm trying to get emergency visitation approved, but the paperwork's stuck somewhere in processing. Kincaid listened with complete attention, not the performative focus of someone waiting to respond, but genuine presence. Have you spoken with your case manager? 3 times. She keeps saying it's being reviewed. I'll mention it to Deputy Warden Chen, Kincaid said. No promises, but sometimes paperwork moves faster with a reminder. Davis's tension visibly eased. Appreciate it, man. Marcus watched this exchange and noted its layers. Kincaid had made no commitment beyond awareness. He'd claimed no influence. Yet Davis trusted that mention would carry weight. Later, in the employee break room, Marcus encountered Officer Jenkins, a 20-year veteran with a reputation for rigid enforcement. You're the records guy, right? Jenkins asked. The one investigating Kincaid? I was helping with documentation irregularities, Marcus replied carefully. Jenkins snorted. Irregularities. That's one way to describe it. He poured coffee with deliberate slowness. You know what I call it? Smart. Kincaid's the most effective person in this prison precisely because he's not official. What do you mean? Officers have authority, but authority creates resistance. Inmates see us as the enemy by default. But Kincaid? He's just the janitor. Nobody's guard is up around him. He hears things, sees things, knows things, and people tell him stuff they'd never tell us. Then he quietly passes that information to people who can act on it. Informant? Marcus asked. Mediator, Jenkins corrected. There's a difference. Informants exploit trust. Kincaid builds it. Last year, we had 2 rival gang members heading toward confrontation. Violence was inevitable. Then Kincaid happened to be cleaning near both their cells, happened to have separate conversations, happened to mention that the beef between them was based on misinformation being spread by a third party who wanted them both locked in solitary. Situation diffused before it escalated. How did he know? Because he pays attention. Because inmates trust him enough to talk honestly. Because he's been here long enough to read patterns. Marcus processed this. But he's just a janitor. Jenkins smiled slightly. You ever read about the Invisible Man? Not the sci-fi story, the Ralph Ellison novel. Being invisible doesn't mean being powerless. Sometimes it means being underestimated, which creates its own advantages. That evening, Marcus stayed late to review security footage from Cell Block D. He watched Kincaid's movements over several weeks, noting interactions, pauses, the subtle body language of both the janitor and those he encountered. What emerged was a pattern of deliberate engagement masked as routine maintenance. Kincaid positioned himself to overhear conversations without appearing to listen. He timed his cleaning rounds to coincide with moments when specific inmates might need private conversation. He created opportunities for people to approach him naturally, without the performative quality that interactions with officials typically required. Most significantly, Marcus observed how Kincaid's presence alone altered behavior. When tensions rose in the common area, his arrival with cleaning supplies prompted inmates to moderate their aggression. Not from fear or authority, but from something more subtle, a shared understanding that his presence represented order worth preserving. Marcus compiled his observations into a memo, but hesitated before submitting it. The information felt simultaneously important and fragile. Documenting Kincaid's effectiveness might undermine the very invisibility that made him effective. He approached Warden Reeves the next morning with the unsubmitted memo in hand. I've been observing Kincaid, Marcus began. Understanding what he actually does beyond janitorial work. Catherine gestured to a chair. And? He's running informal conflict resolution and information management through the guise of maintenance work. He's probably prevented a dozen violent incidents in the past year alone. Probably. Prevented incidents don't generate reports, Marcus acknowledged. But the pattern is clear. His presence reduces tension. Catherine read the memo carefully. This is valuable intelligence. Which is why I didn't submit it through official channels. Documenting his methods might compromise them. The warden considered this. You're suggesting we benefit from maintaining his ambiguity? I'm suggesting his effectiveness depends on being underestimated. The moment we officially acknowledge what he does, he becomes a target for inmates who feel betrayed, officers who resent his influence, or administrators who want to formalize and control his methods. Catherine set down the memo. So we know, but we don't acknowledge. We protect his invisibility, Marcus said, by keeping it invisible. The test. Every system faces moments that reveal whether its principles are genuine or merely decorative, when doing the right thing conflicts with doing the expedient thing. Blackwood Correctional Facility's annual federal audit began on a Monday morning, bringing inspectors whose job was to find irregularities and assess compliance. Thomas Kincaid's documentation was now technically proper, but the 17-year gap remained unexplained in official records. How does an institution protect the integrity of an individual when bureaucracy demands explanations that might undermine the very qualities being protected? Continue this journey to witness how organizational courage sometimes means calculated resistance to demanded transparency. The federal auditor arrived with the cheerful ruthlessness of someone who found professional satisfaction in uncovering institutional failures. Margaret Delacroix had conducted corrections facility audits for 15 years and prided herself on identifying patterns that others overlooked. She began with personnel files, which was standard procedure. Catherine Reeves had anticipated this and prepared accordingly. Your janitorial staff documentation appears irregular, Delacroix observed within the first hour, tapping her tablet screen. Thomas Kincaid shows continuous employment since 2008, but his file contains no hiring documentation from that period. His background check is dated 3 weeks ago. Catherine maintained professional composure. Mr. Kincaid's employment transitioned from an informal contractor arrangement to official staff status during our recent administrative review. The background check you're referencing formalized his position. Informal contractor arrangement? Delacroix's tone carried skepticism. For 17 years? The arrangement predated current administrative leadership. When the oversight was discovered, we corrected it immediately by processing proper documentation. That's a substantial oversight. It is, Catherine agreed without defensiveness, which is why we initiated comprehensive review of all historical personnel records. We identified the gap, investigated its origin, and rectified the situation according to federal employment guidelines. Delacroix made notes. I'll need to interview Mr. Kincaid directly. Of course, I'll arrange it. Thomas Kincaid was notified during his afternoon rounds. He accepted the summons with characteristic calm, finished cleaning the administrative corridor, and presented himself at the designated conference room at exactly 3 p.m. Margaret Delacroix studied him with the assessing gaze of someone trained to detect deception through body language and verbal inconsistency. Kincaid sat comfortably, hands relaxed, expression neutral. Mr. Kincaid, can you explain the nature of your employment here prior to 3 weeks ago? I performed janitorial services as needed, Kincaid replied simply. For 17 years. Yes. Without formal employment documentation. Apparently so. Delacroix leaned forward. You weren't concerned about lack of benefits, tax documentation, legal protections? The work needed doing. I did it. The compensation was adequate. That's irregular, Mr. Kincaid. Perhaps. But irregularity doesn't necessarily indicate malice or fraud. Sometimes it indicates organic evolution of informal arrangements that served their purpose. Federal employment law requires— I understand what federal law requires, Kincaid interrupted gently. I also understand that institutions are composed of humans making daily decisions about how to allocate resources and accomplish objectives. Sometimes those decisions prioritize function over formality. That doesn't make them criminal. Delacroix switched tactics. Tell me about your previous employment. Before Blackwood. Kincaid's expression didn't change. I worked in corrections at another facility. I resigned and chose different work. Why? Personal reasons that don't bear on my current employment. I'll be the judge of what bears on your employment, Mr. Kincaid. Catherine Reeves, observing from the corner, tensed. Kincaid, however, remained unruffled. With respect, Ms. Delacroix, my previous employment history was investigated and documented when my current employment was formalized. I was cleared through standard background checks. My work at Blackwood for the past 17 years speaks to my reliability and integrity. Unless you have specific concerns about my conduct or security risk, my reasons for choosing janitorial work over correctional officer work are private. The auditor studied him for a long moment. You're very composed for someone whose employment irregularity could result in significant penalties for this institution. I'm composed because I've done nothing wrong. The administrative oversight that failed to document me properly is regrettable, but I can't be held responsible for bureaucratic processes I neither controlled nor understood. I showed up, did good work, and was compensated fairly. If that's criminal, then the law itself is flawed. Delacroix made extensive notes. Finally, she closed her tablet. I'll need copies of all documentation related to your employment formalization. Of course, Catherine interjected. We've prepared a complete file. After the auditor departed, Catherine and Kincaid remained in the conference room. That was risky, Catherine said, refusing to discuss Riverside. She has no authority to demand information beyond what's relevant to current employment. My past was investigated and cleared. Anything more is overreach. She could push. Kincaid smiled slightly, a rare expression. She could, but she won't. Auditors look for patterns of institutional failure, not individual backstories. I gave her no reason to suspect I'm a security risk. That's all that matters. You're very calm about this. Panic accomplishes nothing, Warden. Either the documentation satisfies federal requirements, or it doesn't. My anxiety won't change that outcome. Catherine recognized the wisdom in his words. Thank you for handling that professionally. Thank you for protecting my privacy, Kincaid replied. That took courage. He stood and returned to his rounds, leaving the warden to contemplate how courage manifested differently, depending on one's position in the institutional hierarchy. The archives Speak Truth has a peculiar quality. It can remain hidden for decades, but once uncovered, it reshapes everything that came before. Marcus Webb's investigation had answered the question of Thomas Kincaid's bureaucratic absence, but it hadn't answered the deeper question. Why had Daniel Foster, the late maintenance supervisor, chosen to help a man avoid documentation in the first place? What debt or principle motivated that initial decision 17 years ago? The answer waited in the archives, in folders nobody thought to examine, because nobody knew what questions to ask. Follow this chapter to discover that sometimes the most important stories are preserved not in official records, but in personal correspondence that accidentally becomes historical document. Marcus Webb returned to the basement archives on a Friday afternoon, driven by curiosity that had transformed from bureaucratic necessity into genuine investigation. He'd found Thomas Kincaid's file from Riverside. Now he wanted Daniel Foster's. Daniel Foster had worked at Blackwood for 23 years before succumbing to lung cancer in 2011. His personnel file was thick with performance reviews, maintenance reports, and administrative correspondence spanning more than 2 decades. Marcus began reading chronologically, looking for any reference to Thomas Kincaid or the decision to bring him on without documentation. He found nothing in official records, no hiring memoranda, no budget requests for additional janitorial staff, no acknowledgement of Kincaid's existence. Then, filed in a section marked Personal Correspondence, Archived, Marcus discovered a letter dated January 2008. It was handwritten on personal stationery, addressed to Foster at the prison, but marked personal across the envelope. Marcus carefully unfolded the yellowed paper. Daniel, I know what I'm asking is irregular. Thomas Kincaid worked for me at Riverside before the investigation that ended multiple careers, including his, though he did nothing wrong except tell the truth. That truth protected inmates from abuse, but it made him unemployable in corrections. Officers won't work with someone they see as a traitor, even when that person simply refused to participate in brutality. Thomas is good at what he does, not just competent, exceptional. He understands that maintaining order requires treating people with dignity, regardless of what they've done to earn incarceration. He's also paying the price for integrity, which is something our profession doesn't reward as much as it should. I can't hire him officially without triggering questions that will follow him to Blackwood. But he needs work, and more importantly, he needs work that allows him to contribute without becoming a target again. You mentioned needing janitorial help during your facility expansion. If you could bring him on informally, just put his name on the schedule, let him work. I'll personally vouch for his character and reliability. I know this violates protocol. I'm asking anyway, because sometimes protocol serves bureaucracy rather than people. Thomas served our profession honorably. Our profession failed him. This is a small attempt at making that right. Roger Bennington, Deputy Warden, Riverside Correctional Facility. Marcus read the letter 3 times, feeling pieces click into place. Roger Bennington was now retired, living in Florida, but his reputation in corrections was distinguished. If Bennington vouched for Kincaid, Foster had probably trusted that recommendation without hesitation. But there was more. Tucked behind the letter was Foster's response, apparently kept as a carbon copy before being mailed. Roger, I remember Thomas Kincaid from the investigation reports. I also remember thinking that anyone willing to testify against colleagues for the sake of protecting inmates had more integrity than 90% of people in our profession. I'll bring him on. Informally, as you suggested. The budget allows for contracted maintenance work, and I won't ask questions that might complicate his future employment elsewhere. He can work, earn honest pay, and do so without the target that official documentation might create. You're right that this violates protocol. You're also right that protocol sometimes serves systems rather than people. Every profession needs people who prioritize integrity over convenience. The least we can do is ensure those people can still make a living. Tell Thomas to report Monday morning. I'll have work waiting. Daniel. Marcus sat in the silent archives, holding correspondence that explained everything. Foster hadn't circumvented protocol carelessly. He'd done so deliberately, to protect someone whose integrity had cost him his career. The decision created a 17-year bureaucratic anomaly, but it also allowed Thomas Kincaid to continue contributing to the corrections system in a capacity that utilized his skills without exposing him to the hostility that official recognition would have generated. Marcus photocopied both letters and brought them to Warden Reeves's office. She read them in silence, her expression shifting from surprise to comprehension to quiet respect. Foster knew exactly what he was doing, she said finally. This wasn't oversight. It was intentional protection. Do we include this in Kincaid's file? Marcus asked. Catherine considered carefully. No. These letters explain Foster's motivation, but they also document deliberate violation of employment protocols. Including them creates liability for Foster's estate, for the institution, and potentially for Kincaid himself if anyone decided to pursue punitive action. So we keep them separate? We keep them archived, Catherine said. Historical documentation that explains without creating legal complications. If anyone ever questions why Foster made the decisions he did, these letters provide context, but they don't need to be part of official personnel records. She returned the letters to Marcus. File them under Institutional History, Foster's section. And Marcus? Yes, Warden? Thank you for investigating this properly. Not just bureaucratically, but humanely. Understanding why things happen matters as much as documenting that they happened. Marcus returned to the archives and carefully refiled the correspondence, ensuring it would remain accessible to future researchers while protected from routine audits. The truth was preserved, but protected, much like Thomas Kincaid himself. The legacy of invisible service. Every institution eventually faces the question of what it truly values: documentation or contribution, official recognition or effective function, bureaucratic compliance or human dignity. Thomas Kincaid's story had begun as an administrative irregularity requiring investigation, but it had evolved into something more profound, a test of whether Blackwood Correctional Facility would protect the integrity of someone whose greatest value came from remaining unremarkable. This final chapter reveals how organizations demonstrate character not through policies, but through the subtle choices they make about who deserves protection and why. Stay with us to witness the conclusion of a journey that proves the most powerful influence often operates beneath the surface of official recognition. 6 months after the federal audit, which Blackwood passed with minor notations, Thomas Kincaid continued his rounds with the same unhurried precision that had defined his 17 years of service. The only visible change was the official documentation now properly filed in Human Resources. Invisibly, however, dynamics had shifted. Officers who'd previously viewed Kincaid as merely competent janitorial staff now recognized the broader pattern of his contributions, not through dramatic announcement or formal acknowledgement, but through accumulated observation and shared understanding among those who paid attention. Deputy Warden Chen began occasionally consulting Kincaid on issues of institutional climate, not formally, but through carefully casual conversations during routine encounters. "Cell Block C feels tense lately," Chen mentioned one afternoon while Kincaid cleaned the administrative corridor. "Can't pinpoint why." Kincaid paused, considering. Johnson in C-17 received bad news about his daughter. Custody dispute went against him. He's influential among the younger inmates, and his mood affects the general atmosphere. How do you know this? He mentioned it Tuesday. People talk to janitors because we're present but not threatening. The information itself isn't privileged. He'll probably discuss it with his case manager eventually. But right now, he's processing privately. Chen absorbed this. Recommendations? Let it breathe. Johnson's not violent. He's hurt. Give him space to process. Maybe expedite his next scheduled call home. The tension will ease when he feels heard rather than controlled. Chen implemented the suggestion. The tension in cell block C dissipated within a week. Similar interactions occurred with increasing frequency, not because Kincaid sought expanded influence, but because people recognized the value of his perspective. His observations came without agenda or self-promotion, which made them trustworthy. Marcus Webb, now promoted to Assistant Director of Operations, compiled a confidential analysis of institutional effectiveness factors for Warden Reeves. Among 23 identified variables contributing to Blackwood's improved safety record over the past 5 years, one variable appeared repeatedly across multiple categories. Informal staff-inmate communication channels. You're describing Kincaid without naming him, Catherine observed when reviewing the report. Naming him would undermine effectiveness, Marcus replied. But documenting the pattern ensures future administrators understand that formal authority isn't the only mechanism for maintaining order. You've learned something important, Catherine said approvingly. The final test of Blackwood's commitment to protecting Thomas Kincaid came during a state legislative review of corrections spending. Budget analysts questioned why certain facilities maintained lower incident rates despite comparable populations and security classifications. Representative Julia Hammonds visited Blackwood personally, conducting interviews with staff and inmates. She was sharp, experienced, and specifically interested in operational practices that differed from standard protocols. Your incident rate is remarkable, she told Catherine during their private meeting. Significantly below state average. What explains it? Catherine had prepared carefully for this conversation. Comprehensive staff training, consistent policy enforcement, and cultivation of institutional culture that emphasizes human dignity alongside security. That's the official answer. What's the real one? Catherine smiled slightly. Representative, the real answer is that institutions function best when formal authority is complemented by informal relationship building. Our staff, across all classifications, invest in understanding individual inmates as people rather than merely as security risks. That investment creates cooperation rather than constant conflict. Give me a specific example, Catherine thought carefully. We have a janitor who's worked here 17 years. He knows every inmate by name, not because it's required, but because he treats his work as service rather than mere employment. That attitude permeates the facility. When staff, even in roles considered menial, demonstrate consistent respect, it models behavior that inmates reciprocate. I'd like to meet this janitor. He's not particularly articulate about his methods, Catherine said carefully. He just does the work. Interviewing him might prove less illuminating than observing how the facility functions as a whole. Hammond studied the warden. You're protecting him. I'm protecting the culture that makes him effective. Recognition sometimes undermines the very qualities that make someone valuable. The representative considered this. All right. I'll observe generally rather than spotlight individuals. But I want this operational approach documented in your next administrative report. Other facilities could learn from it, Catherine agreed, and the review concluded with commendations rather than budget cuts. That evening, Thomas Kincaid worked late, cleaning the administrative offices after regular staff departed. He moved methodically, his practiced hands maintaining order in a building dedicated to maintaining order among people who'd fundamentally disrupted it elsewhere. Warden Reeves encountered him in the hallway near her office. Working late, Thomas? Routine maintenance, Warden, nothing urgent. She hesitated, then spoke with uncharacteristic openness. I wanted you to know. The legislative review went well. Your work was indirectly cited as an example of institutional effectiveness. Kincaid paused. Indirectly? Without naming you specifically. Protecting your preferred obscurity. He smiled slightly. I appreciate that. Can I ask you something? Off the record, Person to person rather than warden to employee? Of course. Why do you really do this? You could work anywhere. Easier jobs, better pay, more recognition. What keeps you here, doing work most people consider beneath them? Kincaid leaned against his cleaning cart, considering the question with the same careful attention he brought to all things. Purpose, Warden. Not the abstract philosophical kind, the practical, daily kind. I know that every floor I clean contributes to order. Every conversation I have with an inmate might prevent violence or provide hope. Every observation I share with officers might protect someone vulnerable. That's purpose. Recognition is just noise around purpose. It doesn't enhance the work. It often complicates it. Most people need recognition to feel valued. Most people measure value externally. I learned to measure it internally. The question isn't whether others appreciate my contribution. It's whether the contribution itself has integrity and effect. Catherine absorbed this wisdom. That's a rare perspective. It's a learned one, Kincaid replied, usually learned painfully. He returned to his work, leaving the warden standing in the quiet hallway, contemplating how institutions were ultimately shaped not by policies, but by individuals who chose daily to do good work regardless of whether anyone was watching. Thomas Kincaid, the janitor who didn't exist in any record until someone checked the archives, continued serving with the same invisible dedication that had defined 17 years. His story would never appear in official histories or institutional legends. He existed only in the accumulated small moments of connection, observation, and quiet maintenance that transformed a correctional facility from merely functional to genuinely humane. And that, perhaps, was exactly how he preferred it. The end. If this story resonated with you, consider how often we overlook the people whose quiet contributions maintain order and dignity in the spaces we inhabit. True influence rarely announces itself. It simply does the necessary work, day after day, whether or not anyone is keeping records. Share this story if you believe that sometimes the most powerful legacies are built by those who deliberately avoid recognition.